In introducing our keynote address today, telling you more about Bonnie Campbell. Okay, I wanted to thank and recognize the members of the board of the Network Against Human Trafficking. If you all will please stand up. John Chesser, George Belitzes, who just stepped out of the room, looks like. Molly Weber. Please, John, stand up too. Teresa, who is not here. Who else am I missing? Judy Kading. Judy was, okay, there you are. Who else am I missing besides George? I think that's it, and me. So thank you so much. If you help me give him an applause. Let's see. I would also like to share with you about the Network Against Human Trafficking a little bit. The organization was incepted in 2005. At that time, I had been working on human trafficking for a couple of years already. It was a struggle at the beginning to convince people that human trafficking was a problem in Iowa. It was a struggle for me to prove it because, as you have learned, it's not very easy for victims to say, hey, I'm a victim of human trafficking, so count me in, and it doesn't work that way. So over the years, more cases have been prosecuted, more agencies have learned about the problem and therefore have identified victims that they serve as being trafficked, so which has been very helpful for the cause of the network. If you want to become a member, which is completely free, and join the listserv, become a volunteer specifically, take any type of leadership that you want on this issue, basically. In your folder, you'll find a membership form. And also in our website, there's an electronic form you can complete and fill out. Okay, but so the last 6 years since the organization was incepted, a lot of things have happened in human trafficking. One of the highlights is in 2006, working with Maggie Tinsman, who is here today. We passed successfully a law to fight human trafficking in Iowa. We have also established protocols with different nonprofit organizations across Iowa to create a method to refer victims between agencies, establish some MOUs with those organizations also to formalize that process. We have also done countless number of presentations and workshops and educational opportunities to raise awareness about human trafficking. And we have also expanded the network of volunteers and agencies who are involved in the issue. So those have been good accomplishments. Many of you have been involved on this issue since the beginning of the organization. Some of you later on. Some of you have worked with me even before the inception of the Network Against Human Trafficking. So thank you for all the work that each one of you have done. Also, I wanted to mention and share with you that although the organization, the conference is taking place at ISU, there are 3 people at the University of Iowa who have been very instrumental on this issue, very passionate since I remember, since at least 2003. One of them is here with us. Her name is Amy Weisman. She's the director of the Department of Human Rights of the University of Iowa. And there's also Professor Mark Seidel, who is a law professor, and he, in the University of Iowa Law School, he started a class on human trafficking for law students. So that has helped a lot. And also Professor Seidel has worked in Harvard University with human trafficking cases and also assisted in prosecution with the largest human trafficking case prosecuted in U.S. history in American Samoa. Also, I want to make mention of another professor who tragically passed away in 2006 at a very young age. His name was Kenneth Camille. If any of you had the chance to meet him, like I had the opportunity to meet him, he was extremely intelligent, eloquent, passionate person about this problem. And he was one of the lead persons in the School of Social Work at the University of Iowa. I will never forget him. I will never forget Professor Seidel either. From the law school. He's now between the University of Wisconsin, for what I see, and the University of Iowa. So his work continues to expand. We invited him to be here today, but he had other more important international commitments to attend. So it would have been great to have him here. With no further ado, I want to show you a video about Luis de Vaca. Like I mentioned this morning, he is the head person of the U.S. Department of State to Office and Combat Trafficking in Persons, but I don't know if the video, the projector is on. Is it on? Oh, we will be soon. Thank you. Luis de Vaca is somebody who I have known also since at least 2003. I met him at a training on human trafficking in Atlanta. At that time, he was a prosecutor with the Department of Justice. And he told me, hey, I'm from Iowa. And so we started to talk. He told me he's the person who's been prosecuting most cases on behalf of DOJ. And I saw him as I began to work more in the nonprofit area of human trafficking, that Luis de Vaca was being recognized by nonprofits and organizations across the country as a very powerful ally, somebody who in Washington and in national and international governmental efforts, he was becoming more instrumental, more knowledgeable, and extremely helpful to the movement as a whole. So I will play this for you.
I'm sorry I couldn't make it home for this path-breaking conference, but I want to thank the Iowa Network Against...
There.
Hello, I'm Lou DeBaca, U.S. Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. I'm sorry I couldn't make it home for this path-breaking conference, but I want to thank the Iowa Network Against Human Trafficking for hosting this important gathering. And I'd like to commend all of you for your commitment to this struggle. The fact that you're here today shows how far we've come in the last 10 years. For a long time, many people consider trafficking in persons to be an obscure problem that happened in some faraway place. The reality, of course, is much different. Because modern slavery affects us all. It touches the clothes we buy, the food we eat. It happens in our cities and our communities. And it's happening in Iowa. Fortunately, across the country, state and local governments are acknowledging that modern slavery isn't just someone else's problem. Nearly every state has passed comprehensive anti-trafficking laws consistent with the federal statute from the year 2000. Task forces are coming together to prosecute traffickers, to identify the victims, provide survivors the services that they need. Some are formal, funded structures. Some are fueled only by the commitment of dedicated people. Regardless, such efforts are making a difference. Because ultimately, it's groups such as the Network Against Human Trafficking that are going to be the glue that holds this fight together. Forging partnerships at all levels, tapping the expertise of service providers, civil society, research institutions, advocates, and yes, the government. I hope this is a productive session for all of you, and I thank you again for what you're doing in the fight against modern slavery. This is a dehumanizing crime, a threat to our community, an offense to our most important values. Combating this scourge is going to take the sort of innovation and leadership that this conference represents. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out some of the Iowans who taught me about innovation, about law enforcement tempered by compassion. I'm talking about such amazing women as former Story County Attorney Mary Richards, of your keynote speaker, Attorney General Bonnie Campbell, and most importantly, Mary de Vaca. Hi, Mom. Hello, I'm Lou de Vaca.
Enough, Lou, enough. We like you very much. Well, okay, without further ado, I am very pleased, very honored to have Bonnie Campbell with us. I was really hoping that she would be able to join us today and talk to you because, like Lou, she's one of the first people in Iowa who stepped up to fight human trafficking. She was one of the first people to be concerned about this and take the issue to Washington. She was the lead person of the Office of Violence Against Women in Washington. And before that, she was the Iowa Attorney General of Iowa. She's well known, not just in Iowa, but nationally. Personally, I admire her. I think she has done a terrific job in defense of women's rights and to be one of the most recognized leaders, female leaders in the Iowa political scene. So please help me welcome Barney to the podium.
Can I shut this, Alex, so I can put my papers down? Can I? Okay. All right. Some of us aren't that computer literate. I still use paper. Well, first of all, I'd like Mary DeBaca, my friend, to stand up so that we can thank her for raising such a wonderful son. Where are you? There you are. Within the first week that I arrived at the Department of Justice, Lou found me. And it took a nanosecond to see how smart and how wonderful he is. I'm not, of course, even remotely objective on that point. I want to thank all of you for being here at this first Iowa Conference on Human Trafficking. You know, what you're doing today makes a difference, and I'll talk about that. My task is to discuss the recent history. If that's not an oxymoron, I'm not sure. Of efforts to combat human trafficking. I want to talk about my introduction to this issue, this set of issues, because that happened globally, because I was lucky enough to be in the Clinton administration dealing with issues of violence against women. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about what's happening in the states, a little bit more broadly than just Iowa, although that's obviously what's most important to us, as this effort is a focus this year of the state attorneys general. So let me begin with the evolution of anti-trafficking efforts globally. For me, and if there are scholars and historians in the room, please don't hold me accountable for perfection, because the things I focused on are the things I was actually involved in. Isn't that just like people? Many other things likely happened, but these are the ones that I know about and probably more importantly experienced. So right after I joined the Clinton administration, I was asked to be on the U.S. delegation to the 4th UN World Women's Conference in Beijing. You may remember one important moment at that conference when Hillary Clinton stood up and said, "Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights, now and forever." It was controversial. Those words were controversial, even among U.S. diplomats. I saw some of the cable traffic. It all boiled down to its basic bottom line, went something like this: if we have to worry about all these issues involving women, it'll detract from real human rights matters. I'm thinking, what could those be? If it isn't rape and torture and all the things that go on, female genital mutilation, trafficking, and the like, what in the world could it be? Well, at that conference, which was a long conference, something like 3 weeks, we all began to hear. I was on the human rights negotiating team, which was chaired by Geraldine Ferraro. We all began to hear this same kind of pattern from around the world about people being trafficked. But we didn't know what to call it. It's kind of like stalking. I mean, Roxanne left the room, but when we wrote the anti-stalking law in Iowa, we all kind of knew as soon as someone said the word stalking what it was. And finally, after a while, someone came up with the word trafficking, which does call it what it is. And it is modern-day slavery, to be absolutely clear. So now that's on my radar screen, and I get engaged with the State Department. And we're hearing more and more from around the world. And it was really sparked by the leadership of Hillary Clinton and then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And so we move along, and the State Department decides that as we're watching what's happening, that Italy is a major transit country. Origination countries are, for the most part, everywhere, but at that time, Asia and Africa, and those countries affected by the collapse of the former Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. Italy has porous borders. If you just look at a map, it's pretty easy to see why. Anybody in a boat can get there. And other issues about Italy. So I get sent off to lead a delegation to Italy to see if we can do some information sharing, some intelligence sharing. Because after all, the people being transited through Italy are ending up often enough in the U.S. At about the same time, a woman who now works for Ambassador DeBacca, Amy O'Neill Richard, was a senior analyst at the CIA. And unbeknown to me, I'm sure someone knew what she was doing, she did a study of what appeared to be trafficking around the world, and it was a seminal piece of intelligence. She is a great hero of mine, because suddenly we had something to prove what we were hearing anecdotally. And I think her number at that time was they could easily identify 1 million people being moved illegally against their will. But she speculated that the numbers were much, much higher. So I go to Italy, and interesting. I'm working with leaders in Italy, not just me, our delegation. And one of the second visit, major visit we did, was a meeting with a man whose title is the Anti-Mafia Directorate. You know, and I'm sort of politically correct most of the time. I think we don't really talk about the mafia anymore in this country. It doesn't seem right, but that's this man's title. And so we go in to meet him and raise the subject of sharing intelligence. And let me just say that he had an explosive kind of personality. He was very nice, but he was very passionate. He said, I knew you would not know what we are dealing with. So I have to tell you some things. Number one, you don't want to share intelligence with us. We are corrupt, period. But you don't understand what's going on with human trafficking. These aren't just little thugs in the neighborhood in Ukraine or Hungary or Russia. This is organized criminal activity funded by the Italian mob. They're corrupt, every one of those countries. You can't share information with them. They're bought off. And that's what we're dealing with, and that's what you're dealing with, only you don't know it. And he said, and you did a news conference yesterday. You should never have done that. Why don't you just put a giant spotlight on you so they can hit you more easily? He said, you shouldn't even be here without security. Needless to say, my little delegation was a little concerned about that comment, but we did not have security and never would, of course. He said, these people are more sophisticated than you. Us, all of us. They're subterranean some places, but they're very open other places. Until you understand a couple things. There's more money in trafficking in people than trafficking in drugs or arms, and the penalties are either non-existent or are not nearly as harsh. Traffic drugs, use them, they're gone. Traffic people, they're there for a long time. Turns over, it has a wonderful multiplier effect. It was very eye-opening. We did retreat and decided, no, we did not want to share intelligence information with them. He was right on that point. So we moved to an agreement where we would begin a lengthy process of educating about human trafficking, which happens at the International Educational Academy there in Europe. And that was announced in this country by President Clinton, and it was a very big deal. Ultimately, it led to what is called the Palermo Protocol, which is a UN protocol, went to the Commission on Organized Crime. There, and I was not there, I had left the government by that time. There they developed what we lovingly call the 3P paradigm: prevention, prosecution, and protection. Let me emphasize the protection piece of it, because I heard it in the breakout session I was in. It's very, very difficult to get a victim of trafficking to come forward or to cooperate once they have, because if they're from Croatia, so are the mobsters, the traffickers, the thugs who got them here. And their families there. And it's a very simple formula. You talk, we kill your family. Plenty of evidence that they're more than happy to do that. That's a lot of burden to put down on someone who's already been trafficked, or anyone for that matter. The Palermo Protocol, for the first time, called for all countries to criminalize acts of trafficking, including forced labor, slavery, and slavery-like practices. That has grown now to include bonded labor, debt bondage, child soldiers, anything where consent is lacking. Then, just to complete the UN story, the Athens ethical principles in 2006 realized and recognized that we needed to partner with the private sector and have some ethical guidelines which we would follow. Luxor, Mary and I talked about this. I got to go to this UN conference last December, just a few weeks before the Arab Spring started in Cairo, where we attempted to operationalize the ethical principles that were established in Athens. It was very interesting. I heard a lot of conversation about how do we tackle this? How do we identify who's being trafficked? And Professor Downing, I think I have her name right, said it exactly right. We have to not let people be anonymous anymore. We have to talk to people who serve us in restaurants and hotel clerks and begin to really observe. There's just no other way. In the law, we call it being an officious intermeddler. It's okay to do that. I mean, don't go too far, but otherwise, that hotel clerk who was trafficked from Ukraine who's at a hotel in who knows where, Iowa. There's no chance, really, or luck, that she'll be found. So now the UN has said all countries should have an anti-trafficking law. And what Maggie went through in Iowa to convince people that trafficking exists, we went through at the federal level. Finally, Senator Paul Wellstone, may he rest in peace, a wonderful human being, just got it done. But it wasn't easy. It took a lot of work. Even internally at DOJ, people were just, well, there are laws to handle that, smuggling laws, but not exactly right. Anyway, that happened in the year 2000. And the Palermo Protocol was adopted that same year. And that, just to give it its proper name, the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons. Maggie, am I right? We got the trafficking law in Iowa in 2006. And it wasn't easy. I remember talking to Maggie at that time. And maybe it's here because of the sheer force of her will. So we need to thank her for that. It was really a critical thing. So let me just tell a few stories, because it's one thing to understand legally what's out there. It's another thing to understand what is it? What are you talking about? Well, I'm going to take you back to Italy now, a different trip, where I was asked to go to Bologna and meet with a feminist organization, and then to go to a Catholic church. And this will surprise most people here, but turns out the feminists there and the Catholic Church get along just fine when they get along, which is most of the time. The one thing they both told me is they all carried cell phones. Everyone was encouraged to give their old cell phones to the feminist program. Let's call it a battered women's program, something we're more familiar with. And they went out into the streets of Rimini, near Bologna, but Rimini's right on the ocean, and it is Italy's Las Vegas. And they tried to rescue trafficked women mostly, but not always, by getting them cell phones and instructions, trying to figure out what language they might speak. But part of the problem is that those trafficking victims simply were never let out of the little rooms in which they were kept. So there was subterfuge, priests pretending to be hiring prostitutes, and law enforcement. And when I went to visit the Catholic Church, turns out that priest was hiding and protecting victims who had decided to go forward and cooperate with law enforcement officials. Not a small matter. And he asked, his name was Father Don Benzi, would we like to meet with some of the victims? Yes and no. After having met with them, I'm glad I did, but it's painful. I'll just quickly tell you about three of them. One was a woman from Africa whose parents both had been killed in tribal disputes. And all she had left in the world was an aunt who had nothing, and her aunt sold her to traffickers who took her to Italy. She was a little older, she was 23 or so. And then there was a young girl from Ukraine. Her trafficker pretended that he loved her, and her family was desperate after the economic collapse following the collapse of the former Soviet Union. He convinced her that if she went with him to Italy, she was so beautiful, and indeed she was, that he could make her a supermodel, like all the supermodels in Europe and the US. But when they got to Rimini, and he asked her to marry him. When they got to Rimini, he told her that she had to prostitute herself, and she said, "I'd rather die than do that." And he pushed her out of the car and ran over her with it twice. But she survived. She called him her false boyfriend. She was 14. She was going to court, and she was going to testify in the environment in Italy I've already described to you. It's horrifying. I don't know what happened to her. I'm praying. The other victim, and there were about 10 or 14 being kept in this Catholic church, the other victim was simply walking down the street in Budapest, and two men threw her into the car, and that was that. It's a little hard to explain how one's life might be turned upside down when such a thing happens. And so those are the stories. There are many more, many more. But just when you think you could maybe walk away and let somebody else do this work, you find out, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe there's just too much. Well, the good news is I still attend meetings of the state attorneys general because all of us formers have an organization, and it's lovely because it keeps us in touch with each other. This year, the president of the association is the Attorney General from the state of Washington. His name is Rob McKenna. And his entire focus for his presidential initiative is on what he calls the 4 Pillars of Hope initiative. It is getting so much good attention. If you just want to follow it, you can go on the website for the National Association of Attorneys General and look at the 4 Pillars of Hope initiative. The 4 pillars are what you'll all hear all day, and probably have already. Making the case that trafficking exists. We have to build data systems to capture what we are doing, what we are seeing. Prosecute traffickers, and that one, of course, depends on building the case. Rescuing victims, and public awareness and issue advocacy. Those are all critical. Here's what Attorney General McKenna said when he announced this. Listen carefully. Human trafficking is a $32 billion global industry, $32 billion with a B, industry, driven by trafficking profit. It is the fastest growing, and second largest criminal activity in the world, tied with arms and right after drug dealing. And Rob goes on to say, yet for many this heinous crime lurks in the shadows. It's time to bring it out into the light, to bring hope and resources to victims, and to bring justice to traffickers and those who buy victims from them. Well, that is good news. You should know that our Attorney General has been pretty out front on this issue. And perhaps it's because of at least the conversation I was able to hear, but more likely because it's just the kind of issue he'd be out front on anyway. We can be very proud of what the AGs are doing, because here's how it works. In most states, AGs, not most states, in many states, attorneys general do all the criminal prosecution in the state. That's not the case here. But more importantly, the attorneys general and their staff work intimately, closely with prosecutors and law enforcement. And those are the people who make the cases. So to have all the state AGs focusing on this issue is critical. Last week I talked to a friend, a former attorney general from Maine, who had been to a Northeastern Attorneys General conference on human trafficking. And he called me to say, when I walked out of the conference, I was shaking. It is so horrible, the stories that were being told. And I wasn't able to be there, but that had to be powerful, just really powerful. Let me conclude by saying thank you to all of you. Why do we care about this issue? Why do we care about human rights issues more broadly, really? It's because that's who we are. We're called to do that. And you know, don't we all need each other in this world? I like to read a poem that someone brought to my attention when I was Attorney General. If you've heard it before, forgive me. When I first read it, I would have thought that it was some great philosopher, someone famous. Indeed, it might be, because I've no longer remembered the name of the person. But he was an inmate. He was in prison for something, I don't know what. And he wrote this brilliant poem, which I want to read just because it reminds us not only that we do all need each other, but why we need each other. It's entitled, "The Cold Within." 6 humans trapped by happenstance in dark and bitter cold. Each one possessed a stick of wood, or so the story's told. The dying fire in need of logs, the first woman held hers back. For on the faces around the fire, she noticed one was black. The next man looking across the way saw one not of his church, and couldn't bear to give the fire his stick of birch. The third man sat in tattered clothes, he gave his coat a hitch. Why should his log be put to use to warm the idle rich? The rich man just sat back and thought of the wealth he had in store, and how to keep what he had earned from the lazy, shiftless poor. The black man's face bespoke revenge as the fire passed from sight, for all he could see in his stick of wood was a chance to spite the white. The last man of this forlorn group gave naught except for gain. Giving only to those who gave was how he played the game. The logs held tight in death's still hand was proof of human sin. They didn't die from the cold without, they died from the cold within. And isn't that the truth? So I thank you for being here, because I know this to be the case. People you will never see, people who will never know your name, will be saved or helped by the very fact that you are here today. I thank you very much for your passion and your compassion and the chance to speak with you briefly. Thanks.